When it comes to playtime, never let your squad down. Unlock elite gaming tech at Lenovo.com. Push your gameplay beyond performance with 13th Gen Intel Core processors. Upgrade to smooth, high-quality streaming with Intel Wi-Fi 6E. And maximize game performance with enhanced overclocking. Win the tech search and head to Lenovo.com.
Lenovo.
Hey, Typology, before we jump in, I want to remind you that Ian's new book, The Fix, is now available everywhere fine books are sold. We've been talking about it a lot lately on the show, but I really want to encourage you to pick up a copy. Ian walks us through the process of using the 12 steps to reconnect with ourselves, with God, and with others. This book is for everyone, and I know you're going to love it.
Hey, Typology friends, I am so excited. In fact, I have been excited for days about the conversation that I'm going to have today with actually my new friend, John Ortberg. John and I first met probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago at a little coffee shop in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. We were introduced through mutual friends. He is an Enneagram 3, and John has just written a brand new book on the steps, on the 12 steps. It's entitled Steps, which is a perfect descriptor of what the book is about.
Much less creative than Fix It.
Anyway, John is just a remarkable, wonderful human being, and I'm delighted to have him on the show. John, welcome.
Well, thanks, Ian. Actually, I heard you speak, and we met fairly briefly quite a few years ago now. You were at there was a conference at a church called Westgate in San Jose.
Oh, that's right. I forgot that.
So that was the first time I was like, God, this is a really intriguing guy with a really intriguing background and mind, and a number of streams converge in him. And so I just enjoyed that immensely. And then Chasing Francis and, Memoir Life Story was so interesting. And then the Enneagram stuff was just over the top. So I've been looking forward to this a lot.
So, John, what I love about this conversation is, here we have, you and I have both written books on the 12 steps. They're both dropping the same week. And you and I had a conversation where it's like, let's not compete with each other. Let's cheer each other on. Let's get each other on one another's podcasts and be champions for each other's work. And more importantly, to be a champion of the 12 steps as a design for living that anybody can use to develop a richer, deeper intimacy with God. And but let's begin by talking about your Enneagram type and your experience with the Enneagram. We're going to spend a few minutes on that, and we're going to segue right into the book as quick as possible. And I can assure everybody listening, regardless of your Enneagram type, if you think a conversation about the 12 steps is only for addicts as they are classically understood, then you are very wrong, and you are in for a really exciting conversation about something that could really revolutionize your life, regardless if you're a 1, a 3, a 5, a 4, it doesn't matter. We're going to talk about things that will be of really ultimate importance for your life. John, I know you know the Enneagram well. You've known it for years. You're an Enneagram 3. Out of curiosity, are you a self-preservation 3? Do you remember your subtype?
I don't remember my subtype. Tell me what a self-preservation 3 is.
We don't actually need to go, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but the classic 3 is, the archetype that is very concerned. We would say that they have a core motivation would be a need to succeed, to appear successful, and
Yep. Bingo. Bing, 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 bing.
Yeah. And to avoid failure at all costs. But what's interesting is there's one subtype of it that actually is more vain about not being vain. And so their appearance, they don't appear like another subtype, the social subtype. They actually don't look very much like that subtype at all. And so I was curious because I've not experienced you, and it may be because I've gotten to know you later in life, right? You do not have the energy of a 3 in my interactions with you, and I'm just curious as to why that might be the case.
Well, I could be low energy like Jeb Bush. That's always a possibility. But I do think, insofar as I understand that distinction, I would be a 3 with a 4 wing for sure. And I do think, yeah, for whatever reason, I have always wanted to appear like I'm not devoted to image management and I'm not trying to look good. And I think partly because I don't admire or like those qualities. And so I will probably try to lean away from them. And it's almost like a whole nother layer of threeness where it's like, yep, that's who I am. But then I don't want to be that way or don't want to appear that way. And so we'll try not to. So, yeah, it probably goes down a couple of layers.
So, John, the difference between a social 3 and a self-preservation 3 could be described like this. This is slightly a stereotype versus a type, but a social 3 is the one we hear about the most, right? And that a social 3 would want to buy a car or wear clothes that message success. They want to appear successful. So they might buy a Mercedes, whereas a self-pres would probably buy a Volvo. Something more understated, something that is like, in fact, they would find being overly upfront about the search for admiration as being something maybe distasteful or like, oh, does that sound like more like you?
No, for sure. My first car was a 14-year-old Volkswagen Super Beetle. When I started dating Nancy, she talked about how she actually kind of liked that. She was never attracted to guys who were real into cars or into, building up great muscular bodies. So it's like, well, I'm your guy.
Yeah.
So, for sure, when it comes to driving a car, or it will be pretty apparent probably right now, I'm not like a fashion magnet. So yes, that I would definitely be on the self-preservation side and not drawn to obvious social attempts to impress.
So how would you describe your core motivations and fears that drive your life?
I would say core motivations for both better and for worse. I love to grow. I love to learn. I love to feel like I'm developing. I love to feel fruitful and productive. And so that's both good, but it's a negative insofar as I want to look impressive or fruitful or productive or look like I'm quite successful without trying hard to succeed. Like the duck that, looks pretty smooth above water and underneath those little feet are just paddling away. And so on the negative side of all that stuff, insofar as I'm an unredeemed 3, it can be hollow, that quality of deceptiveness, not wanting other people to actually know what's really motivating me. Nobody's around, turn the TV on, and then if somebody's coming home, nope, turn the TV off so it'll look like I was reading or doing something productive. So that dark side is very definitely present for me.
So 3s are known for their tendency to suppress emotions, to maintain productivity and image, right?
Yes.
So has that been your experience, and have you navigated that, particularly as a psychologist?
Yeah. And I got a PhD in psychology, although I never got a license. So I've never actually been a psychologist. You have to get licensed to carry that title. But that field has always been really, really interesting to me. I'm also a feeler, on the Myers-Briggs. Although I just have to say, we're talking now, as when we talk about Myers-Briggs and Enneagram, I was at an event a year or two ago, mostly for academic psychologists that Templeton sponsored, Psychology for Ministry. And they put both Myers-Briggs and Enneagram in the same category as the Zodiacs. Like, why don't you just talk with people about their signs? So I recognize that there can be interesting conversations about all this stuff. But on the Myers-Briggs, I would be very much a feeler. And so I would say I can be in touch with my emotions in that way. I definitely feel stuff. However, if you were to ask me questions like, what do you want to do with your life? My default mode is, no. You tell me what track I'm supposed to run on, and then I will muster whatever gifts I have to run as hard as I can and try to win or look like I'm doing really well with it. But if you ask me, what do I want? It's a question that Jesus would ask folks sometimes, what do you want? And I will have a harder time with that question. Something as simple as, if it's Christmas time, what do you want for Christmas? What gifts can we give for you? My wife, Nance, is a 7, and she will have a long list in a quite joyful way. And I will have a much harder time with that sort of thing. So it's much easier for me to just go into a grind it out, get work done mode. And those kind of questions about what's your basic desire, I wrestle with much more.
All right. So one last question on this, for the Enneagram side of just understanding you and wanting to know more about you. What's one thing you've learned about yourself as a 3 that has helped transform your spiritual and emotional and relational life?
One item for sure, these last several years have involved lots more kind of pain in life. And at one point, after I had left my old job, a group of folks got together just to give a day of encouragement for Nance and me. And they went around and talked about what are ways that we had connected, that I had noticed them, spoken into their lives, made a difference for them. And one of the things I realized when they were talking about that was, if somebody were to say I had given another sermon or written something else or something that was good, it wouldn't mean very much. It wouldn't be bad, but it wouldn't mean too much. But if somebody said that I had noticed them, walked alongside of them, connected with them, had a significant conversation with them, that was deeply meaningful to me. However, and I think this is partly 3ness and wiring, and so if I spend an hour talking with somebody, I don't get the same sense of fruitfulness or productivity, or now I've achieved something worthwhile today, that I get if I create content or write something or give a talk or something. So I learned there's kind of a disconnect between what makes me feel fruitful, productive, even worthwhile in the moment, and what I know will be the most meaningful things to me when I'm on my deathbed. And it doesn't mean that learning and trying to understand and trying to preach or teach or write is a bad thing. It's a good thing. I know from other people who do that, the impact they've had in my life. So it's not that I would let go of doing those things, but I have to lean in disproportionately to the conversation, relationship, connection side, because I know that will be most deeply meaningful to me, but my autopilot doesn't necessarily move me in that direction.
Another person, I have another friend of mine who has a problem that might be similar. So when you're in ministry and when people know that yeah.
That would make me feel good.
You're a pastor, you have a background in psychology. From a distance, people then expect you to be a hug-a-bear kind of guy who's going to want to sit with them and listen to their problems, right? So they come to you with that expectation. That might be quickly dashed when they realize, oh, wait a minute, this guy is much more interested in maybe other things. And there's a kind of disappointment that comes on, or even resentment that you fooled them somehow. Has that been a dynamic in your life?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think it's harder for me to acknowledge it or even see it real clearly. And again, partly because I am a feeler, so I can feel very deeply with people. And I think I can mistake that, just the capacity for feeling, with emotional connection. And I'm also more of an introvert. I think when people will hear me preach, it can be very easy to feel like if I hear somebody else that's speaking, I could connect with them. We could be really good friends. I would like to do that. And so I definitely think the way that I will navigate life will mean, and has meant for folks, at times a sense of distance or disconnection, or if I'm kind of preoccupied working on something, and when I was working at church, somebody would come into my office, it would be easy for me to feel like, I just don't want to be distracted right now. Whereas for Nance, who's naturally an extrovert, it's like any distraction is welcome. Come in, sit down, we'll talk, we'll laugh. I like to think of myself as that way, but I know I'm not actually that way. And that can be quite painful for me. And trying to navigate, where do I accept my wiring and say, yep, I'm more of an introvert. I tend to be more captivated by ideas and wanting to learn and communicate in that way. And God made me that way, and it enables me to be helpful to other people so I can embrace it. And then where do I need to say, no, I know relationships are the most meaningful thing. People are the most meaningful thing. My ego and preoccupation with self can keep me from letting go of that and just being with you right now and wanting to see you and care for you and love you and serve you. And so I got to keep moving and growing in that. And that trying to navigate, what do I need to accept? I mean, there's serenity prayer. What are the things that I can't change that I need to accept? And then what are the things that I can change where I need the courage? How do I get the discernment for that? I would say, Ian, that's a constant journey for me. It's a constant journey for me.
So let's get into the book, right? So I have a new book titled The Fix, How the 12 Steps Offer a Surprising Path of Transformation for the Well-Adjusted, the Down and Out, and everyone in between. You have a brand new book titled Steps, A Guide to Transforming Your Life When Willpower Isn't Enough. And I really want to dig into this, and we're going to, pepper it with a little bit more Enneagram stuff. But let's just begin with comparing our definitions of addiction. Let's go there first.
Yeah. So part of the idea with this book for me, because I've always been really interested in change and how does change happen, is the fact that it is a way of life that was kind of taken from Christian discipleship, as you know, a group called the Oxford Group. And then folks who were addicts who entered deeply into it for the first several years, that's all there was the Oxford Group and Bill W. and Dr. Bob and then others. And they found if they practiced this way with sufficient intensity, oh, by the way, they also got the power to be delivered from this hellish addiction. So I think about the 12 steps as being helpful to everybody, whether they have an identified addiction or not. The notion of attachment in spiritual life has been a real important one. So I think of addiction, as best I understand it, as kind of a spectrum where it can go from quite light attachment to what we think of as full-fledged addiction that then has those other dynamics of withdrawal and tolerance and denial that are connected with it. But that notion of attachment, which I think, I don't remember this for sure, I think it comes from a French word that has to do with nails or something, like being nailed to something. And that's what addiction is. So the reality is that whether or not we all qualify for being addicted in a real technical or clinical or empirical sense, and I guess there's lots of debates about that, all of us find ourselves where we're attached to things that we know are not worthy and our willpower is not strong enough to get us out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The way that well, for me, I think addiction is a compulsive attachment to anything. That would be a person, a substance, or a behavior that we use to escape discomfort, to numb pain, even at the cost of our own well-being. So maybe another way to say it is it's an unhealthy relationship, a compulsive relationship with a person, a behavior, or a substance that has mood-altering effects and negative consequences. So that's how I've sort of parsed it out in my own mind, but not dissimilar to yours. And in my book, like I'm sure you do, I talk about attachments as being something that even the early church mothers and fathers spoke about. Right. So, I mean, this topic of addiction has long been in part of the literature of our tradition for 1,500 years.
Yep. Yeah. It's, when Jesus would just talk about things like being a slave to sin, or Paul in Romans 7 just talk about why is it that the things that I don't want to do, I find myself doing, and the things that I do want to do, I find myself not doing. I think that's all ways of describing that sense of attachment to what I know is not of ultimate value. I think it was Philip Yancey, somebody said that what in our day we call addiction, in the ancient world, in the Old Testament world, they called idolatry.
Yes. I think that's tricky, personally. I mean, we can circle back to that.
Yeah.
Because I think what we know now about the neuroscience of addiction, that it's a little bit trickier than that. You know what I mean? Like, yes, and I guess is how I would play with that. Now, you said something earlier, and I agree. There's a continuum of addiction from mild to moderate to severe, right? With different degrees of impact on life and relationships. Does everyone at some level suffer from addiction? Because I'm thinking about Gerald May and his great quote where he says, to be human is to be addicted, and to be addicted and human is to stand in need of grace. So in your experience or in your opinion, is everyone playing around somewhere on the addiction continuum as part of the human condition or not?
Yes, I think I actually don't talk a lot in the book about the concept of addiction. Some, but what was most intriguing to me was the 12 steps themselves as a framework for a way of life that would actually address all of our issues of powerlessness to become the person that we wanted to become.
Yeah.
But I think that in that sense, every single person has attachment. It's interesting. I was reading in the New York Times just a couple of days ago. There's a book that's going to come out in, I think, May of 2025. I forget the author's name, but it's looking at revenge as the ultimate addiction.
Interesting.
And, he writes apparently a fair amount about neuroscience. It's a fascinating way to think about anger, and just to think about how it's possible to become so wrapped up, to have my identity so connected to anger, to perceiving myself as a victim, that I just become unable to let that go. And so I think that happens deeply to us in pretty much all areas of life. There's just this dynamic to sin or fallenness, or however we want to try to describe it, that is enslaving. So yeah.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp.
When we think about relationships, we often think of the red flags, things that tell us there's a problem or that we need to walk away. But what if we focused more on looking for green flags in our friends and partners?
What do you mean by that, Ian? Can you give us an example?
Well, green lights are the positive qualities in a healthy relationship. So a green flag could be something like you feel comfortable and safe around your partner, or, you both respect each other's boundaries. A good therapist can help you identify green flags, actively practice them in your relationships, and then embody the green flag energy yourself. That's where BetterHelp online therapists come in. Whether you're dating, married, building a friendship, or just working on yourself, BetterHelp therapists can guide you toward healthier, more fulfilling relationships. BetterHelp is fully online, making therapy affordable and convenient, serving over 5 million people worldwide. And with their diverse network of more than 30,000 credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties, you're sure to find one that works for you. Discover your relationship with green flags with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/Typology podcast today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Typology podcast. It's so interesting because actually the Enneagram, and I don't spend much time in my book talking about the Enneagram, but it actually, if you think about the passions of each of the types, right? So for one's resentment or anger, for twos, it's this pride, and for threes, self-deceit, for fours, it's envy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In a way, each of those is an addictive pattern, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like these are patterns that have mood-altering effect and negative consequences. We can't stop doing them, right? Unless, we have some outside help to extricate us or disentangle us from them. So I like this idea that I want to, in my own experience, now, again, for me, the addiction piece is important just because of my own personal experience. But I think that there's a really important distinction or exploration that has to happen around the topic of willpower and grace. And I know that you take that on, right? So talk to me about the relationship of willpower and grace.
Yeah, and I love Gerald May's that distinction between willfulness, I'm going to clutch and grab on, and you just feel yourself getting tired and sucked into that, and exertion of ego, as opposed to willingness and receiving that which is beyond us. And that's where I think that notion of addiction is so helpful, because on the one hand, there's agency attached to it. In the big book, selfishness, that's our problem. So there is an element where I'm an agent and I'm accountable and responsible. And at the same time, there's genetic issues and environmental issues. And somehow I'm up against a power that is sly and cunning and baffling, and it's way too much for me, and I'm not able to overcome it on my own. And so the issue of will and what's the role of will is a really, really important one. There's a guy named Roy Baumeister, who's kind of the guru. He's a social psychologist in our day, and wrote a book called Willpower a few years ago. And in the field of psychology, generally, they don't tend to talk about willpower a lot because it sounds kind of Victorian and moralistic. But he actually says, no, there really is such a thing as willpower. It's kind of like a muscle where it's important, but it's very easily fatigued. And it's required for, but depleted by things like impression management. So if you're a 3, you use it for that. Go on a job interview or a blind date, you just come home and say, I'm so tired. And it's because of that resisting temptation, trying to persist in something that's difficult, creativity. All of those things deplete our willpower quite quickly. I think the one thing that the will can do that doesn't deplete it, Baumeister doesn't talk about this, Dallas Willard did. The one thing the will can do that doesn't deplete it is to surrender. And so thy will be done, that actually is an act of the will, but you can do that a lot. Dallas used to say the will is made to surrender to God. And in the big book, interestingly enough, when it talks about how when we're agitated, when we're confused, when we're anxious, we pause and pray, thy will be done. You can use your will along those lines all you want to. That's the proper use of the will. It's so interesting. Bill W. there is making exactly the same point that Dallas did, which is that willpower, which isn't nearly strong enough to overcome addiction, alcoholism, even habits in general. Habits eat willpower for breakfast, but the will can surrender. And so that's actually where I think receiving grace, that question of how do we receive grace, and that unfortunately in particularly the evangelical church world, we have distorted or kind of shrink-wrapped grace into just the forgiveness of sins.
Yes.
And again, I tend to talk about Dallas a lot because he was so helpful to me, but he would often talk about primarily we experience grace as God's power doing within us what we cannot do for ourselves.
Right. And there's another big book quote, right? Like that was it's so interesting. I remember when I first read the big book of AA, and for those of you who are listening, when we say big book, we're referring to this text that Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, wrote, and there were other people involved in the writing of it, but he's the principal author. And Bill W., when I read, particularly in those first 164 pages of the big book, there are moments when it feels like I'm reading Paul.
I couldn't agree more. Yes.
Right? It's like, yeah, you're like, man, this isn't, I'm not equating it with scripture in terms of authority, but it feels to me as inspired and like he's channeling.
I could not agree more. I don't know that I've had this particular conversation with anybody else, but yes, inspiration is exactly the word. And I even think, Ian, sometimes it's kind of like in the Bible, when I was younger, I would tend to read it as like moral lessons. So David is good and Joseph is good and we're supposed to be like him. And then you realize, no, they're all deeply flawed people, but somehow they had very powerful experiences with God and spiritual reality. And then they had to find ways to make sense of them. And particularly, yes, with the big book of AA, when you read about what happened to people like Bill W. and Dr. Bob and they were very much ordinary people like folks in the Bible. Bill W. is a very flawed guy his whole life long. but he stumbled into or was chosen by God for no particular reason, just like Israel was, to be the vehicle through which a kind of grace got poured into the world when it was really, really needed, and had to try to figure out how to make sense of it, how to communicate it to other people. And yes, it feels like there is a wisdom, and there'll be so many places. I think about how often in the church we tend to produce elder brothers, and AA, because of the nature of addiction, tends not to do that, because everybody knows if I go down that road of pride and resting on our spiritual laurels, I'll end up drunk or dead or something. And so the big book will talk about how what we have is a daily reprieve based on the maintenance of our spiritual health. So, oh, man, we need that in the church so much. There's not pillars of the faith that are, these giants. That's where pride comes in, and Pharisees and all this kind of stuff. What we have is a daily reprieve. Give us this day our daily bread. And you just read through that and say, man, it is inspired in the sense that the nature of addiction creates a need that can only be met by spiritual power. And it's kind of a forcing function that just keeps the needle pointing true north.
Yes, I love that. So 2 things, everybody. One is I would just strongly encourage all of you to read, whether you identify as an alcoholic or an addict or not, everybody should read the first 164 pages of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, it's got kind of arcane language. There's a new plain language version of it if you want to try that out. But you really, just as a spiritual text, everybody should read it, right? And I think everybody in American literature courses and liberal arts colleges, I think everybody in psychology and seminary, why don't seminaries make people read that as just part of a general, like introduction to American spirituality? Like, it's crazy to me that we have this resource that people don't actually have enough exposure to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It mirrors in so many ways just spiritual truth. There's that one section in talking about surrender where it'll say, we looked for an easier, softer way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Half measures availed us nothing.
Yes.
And it's interesting, C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, when he's talking about how, we're all kind of hoping God will be like the IRS, where they'll make certain demands, but then we'll be left over with, some stuff that's just ours. And it doesn't work that way. Jesus' demand is give me all. And he uses exactly the same word, half measures will not be helpful. And it's so interesting that just even that phrase in the big book and with C.S. Lewis, and it's just recognizing an inevitable aspect of the human condition. We're all hoping to hold on to a little piece of ourselves. And there's something about surrender, willingness, abandon, that puts us in the stream of spiritual reality and grace and power where half measures won't do it.
So, John, you don't identify as far as I know, as an addict or an alcoholic. And I want to know, how then were you introduced to the 12 steps? And how do you personally tap into the 12 steps as maybe a design for living in your own spiritual life?
Yeah, I was first introduced to it way back when I was in college. I was a psych major. I did an internship one summer at, believe it or not, a place called the Spiro T. Agnew Mental Health Center. in Maryland. I think it has since been renamed. That's what it was called. And for anybody who's not 110 years old, Spiro T. Agnew was a vice president who had to resign in some disgrace many years ago. But sitting around that circle and listening to the way people talk was just very powerful and very intriguing to me. And then when I went on to study psychology, it was just very clear this was a community that had tapped into a power for change because they were dealing with addiction. But there were this program, these 12 steps, where didn't involve medication or surgery. They were spiritual steps. And yet, as a matter of empirical fact, hundreds of thousands of people found it to change them. And it was a sobering thing to think as a pastor, if the average person were to come to our church and do church or spiritual life the way that we think about it, would they get sobriety thrown in as a benefit? And basically that's what happened at one time. So that was a powerful part of it. Dallas Willard, whom I mentioned, that's been very influential in my life, writes in a couple of his books, Renovation of the Heart and also The Divine Conspiracy, about the 12 steps, and says if the church ever gets discipleship right, it will look a lot like the 12 steps.
Wow. So unpack that some more for me.
Yeah. In The Divine Conspiracy, he actually lists the 12 steps. And then this is in a little footnote in the back, says, contrasted with this, the superficiality of consumer Christianity in most churches becomes apparent. Imagine, by way of contrast, being part of a church or a local Christian assembly that expected people to practice these steps without specific reference to alcohol. And he talks about how transformation in any way, learning a language, physical transformation, or spiritual, always involves a little acronym he uses, VIM, Vision, Intention, Method. And then to describe that, one of the examples he uses in Renovation of the Heart is the 12 steps. The first 2 steps admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, our ultimate problem, and our lives had become unmanageable. And then the second one, came to believe a power greater than ourselves. Those are both about vision. The negative side is, this is what my life will turn into without God's help. And the positive side is hope. This is what I could become. So that's vision. The third step is intention. Made the decision to turn our will and lives over to the care of God. And then the next 9 steps are all about method. Fearless and searching more. So, this gets into way deep stuff, Ian. But the general idea is, as you know, in AA, they will talk about how essentially what A involves is a program, it's a way of life, and then a fellowship. Going to meetings, having a sponsor, having somebody that I can do step 5, admit the exact nature of my wrongs to, making amends to people, step 12, carrying the message to others. So the program demands that I be part of a fellowship. And really, when you think about it at the broadest level, that's always what a redemptive life is like. So the first fellowship was Israel, and the first program was Torah. And then Jesus comes along and he starts a new fellowship with the disciples, and their program was you just follow him around. And then he leaves. And so in Acts 2, now they devoted themselves to, so they've got a program, a way of life, and a fellowship doing with each other. And then that kind of loses it. So people start going off into the desert. You have folks like Benedict or Augustine who describe, now they have a community and they have a rule of life, a fellowship, a way of life, Bonhoeffer life together. You just see this all the time. And really, that's what AA, that's part of the gift, I think, that it wants to give to the world in our day, is a non-mechanical, non-arbitrary, actionable, concrete way of life. And then there needs to be a fellowship to go along with that, through which we can actually receive the power from God to become changed people. And, so yes. In many ways, I think the 12 steps and again, it's just such a great example of that statement of God, my strength is made perfect in weakness.
Yeah, I was saying to someone the other day, because, in my book, I'm incredibly vulnerable, right? And transparent about some things. And I just said, really, your mess is the message,
Yes.
And I think, as another friend of mine says, Ian, it's so important to lead with weakness. Lead with your weakness, right? And I just think that's a gospel principle, and not when it becomes inappropriate vulnerability, or that we have to be very wise and discerning about the degrees to which we share our stories and where and when and why. But I think that's really true, and as a principle in my life, it has certainly played out as a an instrument of grace. And so, John, what do you say to people who come to you and they say, okay, you've written a book about the steps, right? And but I'm not one of those people. I'm not, I'm really happy you've written it for those people. I know this sounds like an elder brother talking, right? But I'm just saying, those people, what do you say to them? Like, why should they care about the steps?
Yep. A couple thoughts. One is just just to name that the purpose of the church is to make the 12 steps available to anybody, whether or not they think they have an identified addiction. Ultimately, once I've explained that as best I can, honestly, Ian, not too much. What do I say to them? Not a whole lot. I was talking with the guy, Fred Age, who's been part of AA for a long, long time and has taught this stuff for a long time. And he said that he thinks of AA as a wisdom tradition. Most religions are wisdom traditions, and ancient Greek philosophy was a wisdom tradition. How do you arrange your life? And he said the problem that most wisdom traditions have is we have a wimpy step one. As you will know, that hitting bottom, experiencing the pain of powerlessness and unmanageability is the foundation for everything else. Because until that happens and you feel it deeply, and you're asking about my own journey, it was really pain in my life over these last 5 or so years, more than anything else. That's been the deepest part of experiencing, God, I desperately need your help, or I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I think, on the negative side, experiencing that level of pain, and then the positive side, experiencing the beauty of this kind of life that is available.
Yeah.
And connecting the dots for people. You just see step one all over the Bible, Isaiah 6, for I'm a man of unclean lips. But most of us are able to not think about ourselves that way. And those words just look odd, strange. They were probably neurotic back then. Or Peter and Luke, where Jesus is with them, get away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. Or Acts 2:37, Peter preaches to the people and they were cut to the heart. I think for people who feel a deep hunger, that feel like I'm frustrated with my spiritual life, I'm frustrated with my family life, my relation, I get pain here. I think people who are experiencing some of that, then these steps can be enormously helpful. If somebody feels like they're doing great in life and there's just really not too much need there, you might want to take a look at it, but I don't know that it's going to be all that helpful. So,
yeah.
But I think you put your finger on a really important point that a lot of churches will wrestle with for folks that listen to us who are in that sphere. Because I thought about this a lot, and a lot is getting written in our day about spiritual practices, rule of life, all that kind of stuff. I think a lot of us from a certain tradition are rediscovering that. Then you ask, why is that not more transformative in people's life? And I think the real problem is a step one problem, that it's not rocket science to put together. You need to do self-examination. You need to do confession. You need to pray. You need to meditate. You need to serve. You need to fellowship together with other people. You'll need to arrange for some solitude and silence in order to do that. It's like putting a list of practices together and telling people go do this stuff. That's not all that hard. What happened with AA is people were under such a desperate need that they found a way that actually worked and practiced it with sufficient intensity.
Yeah, I'm sorry, continue.
Well, just so you find this also not just with addicts, but people in prison. Often if folks are there, it's like, I can go this way with my life, or I can try to follow God. Now, if I'm going to follow God, I'm going to have to do that with a pretty intense and clear way. Or people in great poverty, or people where the church is going through a lot of persecution, or people maybe that have felt a great failure, depression, divorce, terminal illness. The program, the way of life, tends to be most transformative for folks who have the gift of desperate need. There's Father Dowling, who is kind of the Jesuit advisor to Bill W. for years, and he himself was not an alcoholic, but benefited from it a lot, wrestled with gluttony, among other things. The last letter he wrote was to the underprivileged non-alcoholic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love, a lot of people in meetings will say, I was blessed with the gift of desperation.
Yeah.
In fact, they use the acronym GOD, gift of desperation, and I don't equate the two, but I understand the sentiment behind what they're trying to express. So John, we both struggle with the same thing, not knowing each other. We're working on similar books. That, my concern was, how are people actually going to do this without desperation? Because, the deal is this, right? maybe this is what separates the church from OA, NA, because there's like 300 different registered groups, Spending Anonymous, Debtors Anonymous, right? Whatever it is, whatever has brought you to your bottom, right? Here's how I would maybe describe the difference. For people upstairs, not in the meetings in the basement, right? People upstairs in the church, for them, in many ways, God is a preference, right? It's like, my life is really enhanced and enriched by a relationship with God. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's just God is a preference. Mm-hmm. In the basement, there is either a God or there isn't, and my life depends on my being in a relationship with God. It depends on it. And I think that is why we talk about that moment of desperation. And because I think everyone's in desperate straits. I mean, if we read the scripture, everyone's in desperate straits, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. So how do we get people, if it's even possible, to at least touch at some meaningful level their own desperation?
Yeah. In recovery, they have 1,000 sayings for stuff. And one of them, because normally they would meet downstairs in churches on metal folding chairs, drink bad coffee, is when you come to church, you can go upstairs and hear about miracles, or you can come downstairs and watch them.
Yes.
And as a pastor, that's very sobering. And there's a book, From Basement to Sanctuary, by a woman named Holly, and she writes about, just train wreck of a life, all kinds of awful abuse, sexual assault, horrible decisions, alcoholic when she was a freshman in high school, and then coming to sobriety. But about 8 years into that, she became suicidal, even though she's sober. Another saying, what do you get when you sober up a drunk horse thief? And the answer is a horse thief.
Yeah, that's right.
You still have all these other issues to work on. And so she met Jesus eventually, about 8 years into her sobriety, and went to church and thought church was going to be like an AA meeting. First time she went to an AA meeting, the worse your story, the warmer you're welcome. Everybody just thrilled that she's there welcoming her. She could not believe that. And then she came to church, and when the service was over, she's never been to church before, so she's just like enraptured. But the guy next to her, his comment was, well, I don't really like the person leading music today. They led from the piano. I like it when somebody leads from the guitar. Nobody in an AA meeting is talking about, didn't like the chairs, didn't like the coffee. And that was the church where I pastored. I remember the day that she was there and talked with me about that. And so her initial response was, oh, I guess the people going to this church are not really like those of us that meet in the basement. I guess they're not that needy and their lives are pretty much put together. But then one weekend, we asked her if she'd be willing to tell her story, and she did. And it is, really gripping. And she said afterwards, what happened was she got an outpouring of letters, emails, notes from people in the church. I was abused. I was assaulted. I'm addicted to this. I have this problem. I'm anxious. I'm depressed. And then she realized, everybody is that needy. It's not as apparent there. There's one whole book by Stephen Haynes that's just called Why Can't Church Be More Like an AA Meeting? Because we talk about that so much. And, I think the answer is it can, if we're willing to be more like alcoholics, if those of us who go to church are willing to be more like alcoholics. But how do we get there? That's a harder question. I do think having people tell their stories, I think the more people tell stories that are raw and honest and truthful, it gives other people permission to do that. And those of us who are pastors in appropriate ways need to seek to do that. I also think as best as I can discern it, that's part of where a movement of God is a movement of God, and we can never quite manufacture it. Nobody whiteboarded AA. It happened. I think we can have conversations about this and identify elements of what would it take to do something. It's good that we can do that, but we'll never be able to manufacture it. We'll never be able to say, okay, now we've identified all the ingredients so we can make it happen.
That's true.
God will have to make it happen. And that's probably a good thing. It's frustrating for me because I feel like my whole life in ministry long, I've wanted to try to find what is the way of life that I can, or a group of us can help people enter into it, where it will just lead to that kind of powerful experience of transformation that Benedict did, or that Acts 2 Church did, or that in a semi-secular ways you find in AA. And I've never been able to. And I think part of that is my own deficiency, but I also think probably part of it is it will just take God at work, and none of us can bottle that. And ultimately, that's probably good, although we get frustrated by it.
So we got to wrap this up because we could talk forever, but I want to ask you this in closing. When I'm writing, I'm thinking about my reader and what it is that I would ideally want them to glean from what I'm saying. And I have a vision of the shifts, the internal shifts that I hope will happen inside them.
Yeah.
What is that for you when you think about your readers of this book?
Yeah, it feels like, the kind of for those of us who are in the church or just interested in Jesus or just interested in life, the Holy Grail, the big pursuit is what's a way of life that can actually help people get in touch with God and be changed. And I think in the last century, out of human weakness, that has emerged. So just to point to that. And that's why, Ian, I'm so glad that you wrote the book and so glad that we get to talk about it. And it's actually a wonderful gift to me because I am a 3. So all of the competitive wiring is inside me. And to be able to think, man, I love your writing. I think your ability to understand, explain, have insight, do it in a way that's hilariously funny and deeply touching the heart is so good. And so to think, my ultimate values are, it doesn't matter who it is that's pointing at it. What matters is this really, really good thing that people could discover and be blessed by. So my hope would be to be one of the ones that points to that and now get to do that alongside of you, which I'm really grateful for. And that's kind of a gift to me in my own development as well. And if there could be a movement and learning and growth as people are thinking about what is the way of Jesus, where this gift could be given. Scott Peck has this wonderful lecture on addiction to sacred disease. And at the end of it, he has this real arresting statement where he thinks God may have sent alcoholism so that AA could emerge, so that the world could be saved through it. And, to get to be pointing towards something like that in people's lives, that would be very meaningful to me.
Everybody, we've been talking with my friend, John Ortberg, author of the brand new book, Steps, A Guide to Transforming Your Life When Willpower Isn't Enough. John, thanks for being on the show. Everybody, you can pick up this book on Amazon or wherever books are sold. John, what's your website and your social information so people can keep up with you?
I do kind of a daily podcast most days, and it's just called Become New, becomenew.com. If folks were to Google that, that would do it. And there's, I think, some social media stuff attached to it, but I'm not real active with all of that. I'm assuming you're not asking for my social security number. So I won't give that. But anyway, that's it.
Great. Well, John, thanks for being on Typology. Everybody listening, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace, may you have healing, and may you have rest. Until next time.